I'm Janice Fiamengo. Imagine the following scenario. A 16-year-old girl is visiting her boyfriend aged 18 to watch TV. They've been dating for 6 months and are madly in love and have talked a lot about going all the way, but there's never been a perfect time. Tonight, when her boyfriend opens the door, he's beaming with anticipation and tells her, "My parents won't be back for hours." The girl wants to tell him that she doesn't really feel ready, but she knows how disappointed he'll be, and she definitely doesn't want to risk losing such a wonderful boyfriend. So although it isn't really her choice, she agrees to have sex with him for the first time. Was this girl raped? Most of us probably wouldn't think so, but according to a new study garnering a lot of media attention, she was. The inflammatory headlines tell us that, quote, 1 in 16 women report their first sexual experiences were rape or assault. Or even more emphatically from CNN, for 1 in 16 U.S. women, their first experience with sexual intercourse was rape, study says. Looking into the study, we can see the dubious manner in which researchers arrived at such alarming news. The study was published online in the JAMA Journal of Internal Medicine on September 16, 2019. It analyzed data gathered over 6 years in 3 waves of interviews from 2011 to 2017 by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. These were interviews of over 13,000 American women aged 18 to 44. And the study found that 6.5% of the women reported what the researchers called forced sexual initiation. Extrapolated to the entire U.S. population of women in that age group, that's more than 3.3 million women found to be victims of forced sexual initiation. And we'll get to that crucial definition a little later. A range of negative health and psychological outcomes were reported by these women at higher rates than experienced by women whose first sexual experience was not forced. These negative health outcomes included pelvic inflammatory disease, endometriosis, menstrual problems, general poor physical health, difficulty completing tasks outside the home owing to a physical or mental condition, and illicit drug use. Now, the researchers admit that it is impossible to say that forced sexual initiation caused these other reported problems. There may be no relation at all, or it may be that women with poor mental health or physical problems are more likely to remember their first sexual experience negatively. But the researchers dwell on their findings of correlation in a way to suggest that causation is likely. And they also emphasize the need for, quote, socio-cultural changes to prevent sexual violence. In other words, they're advocating yet more wide-ranging feminist programs and policies to shame men and empower women. Reports of the study play up the lurid 1 in 16 number and even extrapolate that number beyond the survey group. The main author of the study, Dr. Laura Hawkes, is quoted in NPR News as saying, quote, "It's quite alarming. And that's just the tip of the iceberg because this study is only including women aged 18 to 44. You can imagine that if we asked this of women of all ages, the absolute number would be many millions higher," end quote. Well, actually, that depends on the fertility of one's imagination and how one defines many. Because if the absolute number in the 18 to 44 age group is extrapolated to be about 3.3 million American women, then expanding the survey to include women of all ages might raise the number by another 2 to 3 million or possibly even a bit more. But it also might not. And it well might lower the dramatic 1 in 16 figure, as it is quite possible that older women who came of age at a time when fewer young people were sexually active would report fewer incidents of coerced sexual initiation. If you're having sex for the first time with your fiancé or husband rather than with someone you barely know, you're less likely to define it as coerced. But given that the survey did not include women in other age groups, it is highly irresponsible of the lead researcher to be asking us to imagine the, quote, many millions more women likely to have been sexually coerced. And it is also highly irresponsible to speak as if the study shows us anything definitive about numbers of women raped, because it doesn't. It shows us the number of women who reported, emphasis on reported, that their first sexual experience was not their choice. And we'll get to what that really means in a minute. It's not much of a stretch to guess that Dr. Laura Hawkes is a feminist. Her study and the articles written about it contain the typical misrepresentations and slippery wording we have come to expect of feminist approaches to counting female victims, which almost always seek many millions more. Now, before I get to the actual survey data, I want to mention one other thing. Perhaps not incidentally, the study notes that, quote, response rates for the survey ranged from 67% to 73% for the included years, end quote, which is another way of saying that the non-participant rate, in other words, the percentage of women who declined to answer the questions, was between 28% and 33%. Now, experts disagree about the significance of non-response rates, but certainly some researchers are emphatic that any response lower than around 80% should raise alarm bells. For example, Stephen Ciro et al. Note in a paper published in 2006 for the Association for Information Systems journal that non-response significantly impacts the degree to which one can make accurate inferences from the survey data. They confirm that an 80% response is the gold standard, but even with that, they stress, still means that 1 in 5 didn't respond. So with a response rate of 67% for one of the waves of this survey, we're looking at 1 in 3 women not answering the questions. It's a relatively high non-response rate, and it does raise some question about the representativeness of those women who did answer. But putting that aside, far more serious is the methodology of the survey, specifically the survey question about sexual initiation and the follow-up questions, which employ an overly broad definition of coerced sex. So let's look. Respondents were initially asked, would you say that this first vaginal intercourse with a male was voluntary or not voluntary? That is, did you choose to have sex of your own free will or not? Then if they answered no to that question, women were asked follow-up questions about what the researchers are calling the, quote, method of sexual coercion, even though it hasn't been established that coercion, which is normally defined as threat or force, was used at all. And many of the methods named aren't necessarily coercive in any way. Here are the follow-up questions about the so-called methods of coercion. Quote, were you given alcohol or drugs? Did you do what he said because he was bigger than you or a grown-up and you were young? Were you told that the relationship would end if you didn't have sex? Were you pressured into it by his words or actions, but without threat of harm? Were you threatened with physical harm or injury? Were you physically hurt or injured? Were you physically held down? Participants could report more than one type of coercion. Well, at least half of these questions aren't about coercion at all, and we'll come back to them shortly. But even without those follow-up questions muddying of the waters, there are a number of obvious reasons why someone who was not coerced might still answer no to the loaded question, did you choose to have sex of your own free will? Now, most basically, the language of the question is simply not clear. The question assumes that any limit on freedom is coercion, but it isn't. You can choose to do something and consent to it, even if it wasn't an entirely free choice. If my friend wants to order Thai food and I reluctantly agree, even though I don't want Thai food, I could certainly say quite accurately that eating Thai food wasn't my choice. But I still consented to it. And it would be ridiculous to claim after the meal that my eating the food was coerced, even if my friend pleaded with me to consent to it. We consent to things all the time that we didn't choose because life is full of trade-offs and negotiated compromises. And sex is no different. In fact, sex may be one of the biggest areas of negotiation and trade-off between men and women. Moreover, it's also possible that a respondent could answer no to the question about whether she chose to have sex because feminists have been claiming for at least the last 10 years that the only sex that isn't coerced involves what feminists call affirmative consent, which they often define as an enthusiastic yes and active participation. But actually, many women, and some men for that matter, are silent and passive during sex, preferring to say nothing. To complicate things further, first-time sex can involve lots of insecurity, uncertainty, fear, emotions that seem anything but affirmative. But lack of enthusiasm doesn't equate to coercion. But perhaps most seriously, the researchers don't distinguish at all between persuasion and coercion. One can be persuaded to have sex because everybody else seems to be having it, because one's partner expresses impatience, because one's partner expresses love, or for many other reasons. If a man says, "Please, honey, do it for me," and his girlfriend says, "Okay, I'll do it for you," well, she's allowed her boyfriend to persuade her. Ludicrously, the researchers might well count her as having been coerced or raped. Let's look again at the worst of the follow-up questions on the so-called methods of coercion. Quote, "Were you given alcohol or drugs?" This is a misleading question. It doesn't distinguish between having a tranquilizer slipped into your drink without your knowledge and willingly gulping down a few glasses of wine to get in the mood. You can be given drugs against your will, but you can also be given them because you asked for them. Did you do what he said because he was bigger than you, or a grown-up and you were young? This awkwardly phrased question stretches the idea of coercion to an unhelpful extent. It takes the biological fact that the average male is bigger than the average female, also that the average female tends to be attracted to an older male and vice versa, and turns these into tools of coercion. But they're only coercive if they involve threats of harm. Were you told that the relationship would end if you didn't have sex? This is a leading question on the matter of coercion. Being told the relationship would end without sex could be a simple statement of fact. "Hey, Marge, I've waited long enough." More commonly, it would be a form of verbal manipulation, and men and women verbally manipulate one another with these kinds of emotional threats all the time. It's the other person's choice still whether to give in to that manipulation or not, but either way, it's not coercion. Were you pressured into it by his words or actions, but without threat of harm? As I've already said, the question conflates coercion, which involves force or threat, with a whole range of forms of persuasion such as flattery, promises, arguments, expensive gifts, sulking, and so on. Some of these may be unethical or immoral, sure, but they're far from criminal. A woman who consents to verbal pressure that didn't involve any threat of harm wasn't coerced. She was persuaded. Not surprisingly, over 50% of the women listed as coerced in this study were coerced by this kind of verbal pressure. The final three questions in this list more clearly indicate force and or threat, but even they have their ambiguities. Were you physically hurt or injured is a very broad question that could refer to accidental injury, such as vaginal tearing that can easily occur in consensual sex. Were you physically held down? Might be answered, yes, he was on top of me. It's not clear that coercion is involved there either. Significantly, the researchers never asked if the respondents said no or indicated in any other manner that they didn't wish to have sex. Why did they not ask that question? The question that is widely understood to most clearly indicate the fact of rape? I think it was because they weren't really interested in getting an accurate account of rape victims in the United States. So I have to conclude that based on all of these problems, it is impossible to trust the 1 in 16 figure put forward by Dr. Laura Hawkes and quoted by mainstream news sources. Not surprisingly, the survey has no data at all on male victims of sexual coercion, but that's another story altogether.